What you're about to listen to is my analysis, a RuneScape retrospective of Wintertodt. Throughout this conversation with myself, I got to cover the following questions. When Wintertodt came out, what the meta was at the time of its arrival, why it was even added to the game, and whether or not it succeeded in that endeavor. I also covered if there were any downsides with its release. Within this analysis, I was also able to analyze the content itself as far as the XP per hour, the GB per hour, the rewards that one can get, collection logs as we see them today, and of course the intensity of the content. And then, if we're talking about Wintertodt historically, we also want to look at it today and where it sits, where it's at in the meta, and of course, as we look forward to the future, what the legacy of this piece of content is. With that introduction out of the way, please enjoy the rest of this analysis. All right, so today we are talking Wintertodt. This is the first skilling minigame, came out back in September 8th, 2016, which, if you guys watched the first episode covering my history with Old School RuneScape, you know that I really didn't start playing until 2018 at the earliest, as far as like the earliest updates that I can remember coming out. That's how I date that. So as far as I'm concerned, Wintertodt is in Old School RuneScape from before I even started playing. Pretty old piece of content by Old School's standards. Now, when Wintertodt was released, the meta for training firemaking was the only way that you have ever been able to train firemaking, and that's fire lines. What is pretty interesting, though, is that with Wintertodt being released as they were filling out Zaya, redwood logs were already in the game. So, to some extent, while Wintertodt did devalue the firemaking grind, it was already devalued a little bit, or at least magic logs were already devalued as redwood logs were in the game. Now, it is nice because Wintertodt is, at least to me, more interesting than just lighting fires in lines. And it also was a boss, so at some level it was dangerous. The many hardcore Ironmen that have lost their status there know this. But if we look at why Wintertodt was added to the game, really, I would imagine it had to be because firemaking was boring. And it also wasn't used for much. And we will kind of examine whether or not it succeeded in solving that problem. I certainly think that firemaking did become more fun. I mean, you had the ability to do the boss in so many ways. You could do it solo, you could do it with a small group of friends, or of course you could just do it as a mass. So because of that, I do think that they did solve the problem of something being monotonous, just lighting lines of fires. Certainly Wintertodt was more exciting than that. Wintertodt also became something that was relatively important. I mean, it became something that was so important that all Ironmen would want to do Wintertodt before moving into any other piece of content. And we'll talk about whether or not that is a successful thing in regard to Wintertodt, or maybe that was a detriment. But certainly firemaking had more eyes on it and more players wanting to train it than before. Something that was also nice about Wintertodt was that it gave reasons to train skills that weren't firemaking. I mean, if you were getting those supply crates from Wintertodt, sure, the GP is always nice, but if you wanted to have the other rewards that you could get be better, you would have to have higher levels in those skills. So, I mean, we're talking herb lore for the herbs, mining for the ores, fishing for the fish, crafting for the gems, farming for the seeds, and of course, wood cutting for the logs. And it's also important to mention that this was the first skilling boss, and we've had more skilling bosses, or at least skilling minigames, come into the game since Wintertodt. So it was successful enough that Jagex decided that they wanted to circle back to it. We just saw the release of the new fledging activity in Varlamore that I do think is solves some of the downsides that exist for those skilling minigames that have been released since. But nonetheless, even still, with the critiques that people have for these skilling minigames, being instanced, feeling like a minigame as opposed to an actual skill, it was still successful enough that they would continue to release these updates, right? We have Temperos, Guardians of the Rift. So while there was that success, kind of alluded to this earlier, the early game now was kind of warped around Wintertodt. You wanted to go and do it before you ended up getting, your HP too highly trained. This, of course, because when you have a lower HP at Wintertodt, when you're taking those, fractions of your health off, if you take a fraction off of 10, your base HP, or you level it, versus taking a fraction off, being level 99 per se, it's much easier to heal when you're very low, right? I mean, you just go get cakes and you'll be able to have a whole bunch of trips with just, a few cakes, as opposed to when your HP was high back before the updates. You'd have to bring something like Brews, which was much more costly. This is coming from a person who wasn't even an iron, right? So that certainly was a downside, that at least if you were an Ironman, you felt pressured to go and do this early. Maybe even as a main, if you had an intention of training your fire making, maybe you didn't know about Wintertodt. So by the time you did get around to training it, maybe there was a little bit of regret that you didn't go when your HP was 10. And what's interesting here is that fire making, you needed 50 to go into Wintertodt. That Wintertodt really didn't change the issue of fire making being a largely not important skill. There was still nothing that needed fire making. About the only thing that you unlocked with fire making was at level 99, getting the skill cape, being that, especially after Wintertodt, it was the easiest skill cape to acquire, and the skill capes do have some nice benefits. I mean, people even using them in the Inferno because of the prayer bonus and defense bonuses. There was also the downside that while there were the rewards from Wintertodt, all of the rewards had nothing to do with how highly trained your fire making skill was. Your rewards were still tied to herblore, mining, fishing, crafting, farming, and woodcutting. If you got those levels higher, you got better rewards, but it wasn't like your rewards for killing the Wintertodt got higher as your fire making level got higher. Of course, your experience rates would get higher because of the kill of a Wintertodt scaling with your fire making level, but the reward of more XP per hour doesn't exactly sound too enticing. There were other rewards, right? I mean, you did the Pyromancer outfit, but again, the reward from training your fire making faster isn't exactly an exciting loop. Sure, there was the pet, but I suppose the most attractive item may have been the Tome of Fire, which I would even argue by the time that Wintertodt came out, the Tome of Fire really wasn't too useful. I mean, the Tome of Fire wouldn't really become an item that I ever wanted to go and get until the Twin Flame Staff would come out. And I suppose, finally you have some other collection logs, like the Brumatorch and the Warm Gloves. Those largely, especially at the time before they were updated, were only able to be used in Wintertodt anyway. So again, the reward structure really was just focused on this circular loop. It didn't really interact with outside of the game. And the one item that would interact largely with outside the game, being the Dragon Axe, was so rare that most likely wasn't worth going. Maybe you got it, if you were rushing Wintertodt right away and you got it before 99, maybe then you'd be happy. But even then, because of how rare it was, most likely wouldn't be the case. So if you actually look at, where Wintertodt is when you're actually playing it, if we want to get on to the actual content itself, the XP per hour, if you take a look, is relatively in line with where fire making training was before the introduction of Corinth. You had magic logs, if you're doing fire lines, getting about 450k XP an hour, and you're hopping worlds in order to get to the Wintertodt lobbies that are just closing up, and still getting your points to get the minimum contribution in order to get the Wintertodt XP, you're looking at upwards of 450k. Of course, if you're doing the game mode more relaxed and say, you're in that level 90 bracket or so, you could be getting, close to, 350k XP an hour, perhaps 300k XP an hour. So it wasn't completely devaluing doing magic log fire lines, but remember, redwood logs were out at the time, right? And if you're doing fire lines at redwoods, that was upwards of 520k almost. So Wintertodt still wasn't the meta way, or at least the most XP per hour. So I would say in that realm, it was a pretty good update. It provided another avenue of leveling that didn't completely detract from the things that came before. Again, in the realm of rewards, everything was largely a circular flow of, you got rewards from Wintertodt to go do Wintertodt more effectively in training your fire making. So really the rewards came down to like the gold you could get. At least for me, that's what I would value. As in, I'm getting the gold. At the time, you still have people needing to get a source of magic logs to go to Desert Treasure. So I suppose if you're an iron, it's nice for that. And as far as the intensity goes, it was a pretty nice piece of content. I mean, you could be making some pretty nice progress on your account towards a max cape while being able to do something that was, largely you sitting on your couch. So where then is Wintertodt today? Well, most of these pain points would end up being fixed in a Wintertodt update in October of 2024. They ended up changing the damage that Wintertodt would deal to not be based on your health bar, but everyone having the same meter that they would call a warmth meter. You'd still have to put on the warm gear in order to make it so that you weren't taking as much damage, but now you could heal the same percentage that a level 10 HP count would. And they also updated the potions that you make in order that those may heal you while you're inside fighting the Wintertodt as well. This made it much more approachable, and it made it so that, characters that were maybe having to use brews in the past could still, stack a whole bunch of HP on one inventory space. And because of these changes, that also meant that there were some things that higher level accounts would have that lower level accounts would not, that could really make, having this, 10 HP system, I say this in quotes with my fingers, this warmth system, where if you're a high level account and you have a HP cape, the level 99 cape, where you're restoring HP faster because of that. And if you have regen bracelet, where you're restoring HP faster because of that, you don't even need to worry about health at all. I mean, you're going to be restoring health way faster than the Wintertodt is going to be dealing damage to you. In that regard, I mean, by the time that this update had came out, I mean, collection logging is the thing, and Wintertodt is excellent for the amount of collection logs it has and how quickly you can get them. It's one of the, I say this, it's one of the only pets that I have. I'm actually curious how quickly the pet can come. I would say super cozy content these days. There is still the, I can feel the cold in my bones. That message comes up way too often, where the Wintertodt is so close to being a really good AFK activity, but because of that, it gets downgraded to being couch content, right? Where I'm watching TV and I'm playing the game. As far as where it sits in the meta today, in the larger scope of the game, because of this mentioned Wintertodt update, you don't need to rush 99 anymore, right? If you want to have that level 99 cape as a new account, there's no need to wait to do Witch's House until you go in to Wintertodt. You can still go into Wintertodt with as high of an HP as you want because of the warmth changes. You're still going to be, air quotes here, healing the same amount of damage anyhow. When it comes to the most meta fire-making XP, fire lines still stand as the best fire-making XP per hour at every single tier. I mean, if you unlock a new tier of logs, the most efficient way that you can get XP, at least per hour, is by burning those logs. Now, if you start to factor in getting the rewards that you can get from Wintertodt, not the uniques, but the resources as well as the gold, which is very nice on an early iron, then you might see that Wintertodt looks more attractive, but those are trade-offs. Now, one of the downsides of Wintertodt was that it didn't necessarily make it so that fire making was any more of an integral skill than it was before, and we've had plenty of updates to Old School RuneScape that have made it to where training fire making is something that you actually want to do because of the extra content it unlocks. One of the highest requirements for fire making, as a matter of fact, I think it's the highest requirement for fire making in regard to quest, is Desert Treasure 2, which unlocks 4 bosses, right? So you have a reason to at least want to go into Wintertodt for a little bit, right? I mean, if you're in Wintertodt 75 fire making, it's not high at all, but it's certainly a lot higher than when Wintertodt was released. Now, there's also other reasons outside of the quest cape where you'd want to train fire making, and those could be something like the lanterns at Guardians of the Rift. That wasn't a reason to train fire making when Wintertodt came out because, of course, Guardians of the Rift didn't exist. It was only because Wintertodt inspired Guardians of the Rift that it would even come into existence. You also have the 66 fire making requirement for fire pits all across Gielinor. Because of making friends with my arm, we got these pits into the game where you want to go out and get these lit so that you can have these bonuses in these areas, like not needing a light source in the Cave Horror Cave or not losing stats as you're on the way to the God Wars dungeon. When the Shades of Morton update came and it was reworked, this would then encourage players to get higher fire-making levels to kill better shades so that they could farm items like the prayer training set more quickly. All this to say, the reason to go to Wintertodt is not only to do Wintertodt anymore. There's plenty of reasons to want to go to Wintertodt to progress your account that aren't just getting that 99 fire-making cape. So I would say in that regard, they've been able to clean up that one downside of Wintertodt, which really just leaves you being in this situation where you have a higher level of fire-making in Wintertodt, you really don't feel like you're being rewarded anymore outside of experience, and perhaps that is all they care about. Because when it comes to Wintertodt, your rewards are not tied to your fire-making level, they're tied to your other skills. That said, though, there is a unique that has gotten way, way better. The Tome of Fire is really good now with Sunfire Pages and the Twin Flame Staff. This is one way that Ironmen, without getting something like a Boa Ferdinand, can find themselves being able to fight Zulrah very handily without having to invest as much as they might have to invest in other pieces of gear. And, of course, this still comes in clutch for Ironmen to be able to get magic logs without having to train their woodcutting level up to the point where they'd have to be able to actually cut magic logs. If we were to look at the legacy of Wintertodt, I mean, I think the biggest impact that Wintertodt had on the game was this idea of a skilling minigame where these became expected, or at least where when people were thinking of a skill and it being bad, they can release some sort of minigame or some sort of instance content, some way of making the skill better that's not necessarily reworking the skill. They can just make a really good piece of content that thematically fits. And thankfully, I mean, I'm glad this happened. There's all sorts of minigame-like ways of training skills now, and truthfully, I think all of them have been successful. Temperos, Guardians of the Rift. I would even say that Hallowed Sepulchre would fall in this category. All of these are great ways of training the skills, but I do understand, and I even share this feeling that maybe we should be a little wary of planning to do this for every single skill. That said, though, I think that Jagex is kind of in on this worry, that they also think that if every skill were to become some sort of instanced endeavor that players would take on, that it would start to feel like the game world is falling apart or falling into instances, which is something that isn't really RuneScape, right? I mean, we've accepted this for bosses just due to the fact that we find that if bosses aren't instanced, we end up fighting each other more than we end up fighting the bosses. When it comes to skilling, there should be a way that we can have things that are still in the world, and I think that Jagex has pulled this off with the new Varlamore fletching activity, where you do have something that is certainly an activity, right? I mean, it's a way of training fletching that isn't fletching, if you will, but it's not instanced, right? I mean, you're running around the new zone in Varlamore, and you also get to engage with players that are doing other things. I myself have been one of those players that's been AFKing the forestry rewards while sitting on one totem as the ints would come by alongside all the other players that are training fletching with the Veil Totem method. This feels much better than, getting on a boat to go fight Temperos on some island or going through some portal in order to go take part in Guardians of the Rift. So while I think that it did start a trend of skills each having a mini game, I think that Jagex has come around and hopefully will continue in the future of not, making these mini games feel so disconnected from the rest of the game world. In any case, that wraps up this RuneScape retrospective. As I start this series, I'd love to hear if you think that there is some other category that I should cover so that the content is covered fairly. I would also love to read what you thought about my analysis of Wintertodt. In either case, let me know in the comments. If you found this to be a good listen, please support the show by liking and subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for listening.